Making your way down the streets of Cleveland in the late 1800s, you might see cable cars, ships coming into port on Lake Erie, or the hustle and bustle of top hat wearing, petticoat clad residents in and out of the shops along the main thoroughfare. And when you got to the corner of East 37th Street and Euclid Avenue, you would see a mansion. But the mansion would probably not be the thing that stood out. Nope, that would be the 60-foot, 80,000-pound tower and the massive wheels spinning on top of it like a fan. With 144 wooden blades, this wind turbine was enormous. It was also the country's first wind turbine used to generate electricity. The engineer Charles F. Brush used it to light up his mansion, and it was pricey. Here's a quote from a Scientific American article from December 29, 1890, titled Mr. Brush's Windmill Dynamo. Quote, "The reader must not suppose that electric lighting by means of power supplied in this way is cheap because the wind costs nothing. On the contrary, the cost of the plant is so great as to more than offset the cheapness of the motive power. However, there is a great satisfaction in making use of one of nature's most unruly motive agents." Welcome to Tiny Matters, a science podcast about the little things that have a big impact on our society, past and present. I'm Sam Jones, and I am joined by my co-host, Deboki Chakravarti.
Charles F. Brush was just one person in a long line of people before and after him making use of one of nature's most unruly motive agents. Today, wind is a major source of energy not just in the United States, but across the globe, and it's continuing to grow. So, how far back does wind energy go?
So the first recorded uses of using the wind are from Persia in the 7th century for grinding grains.
That's Elizabeth Wilson, a professor of environmental studies at Dartmouth. Elizabeth is interested in how energy systems are evolving to meet changing societal needs. She studies new technologies and the coevolution of what she calls the rules, the tools, and the joules. That's joules like Joules. So that's how our institutions are adapting, how our technologies are evolving, and how we're finding new ways of producing energy.
By the 1100s, wind was in wide use in China as well as Europe. They used it for grinding grains, for pumping water, for pressing oils. And in Europe, it was fully embedded into kind of the feudal economics of the time, where you'd have the manor house and they would control the mill.
First, I never thought of the fact that it's called a windmill because they were used to mill things like grain or oil.
Yeah, I had no idea either.
Okay, that makes me feel better. But second, when I think of old school windmills, I think of the Netherlands. And there's a reason for that. The Netherlands is very close to sea level. In fact, around 2/3 of its area is subject to flooding, which is pretty wild. So back in the day, the Dutch used windmills to pump water out of the areas that were most vulnerable to flooding and into the rivers. And while there have been a number of windmill designs, the one you're probably picturing used sails that were connected to a shaft that would rotate. And when the wind would blow, that kinetic wind energy would be converted into mechanical energy, powering machinery that would grind grain or pump water or even cut wood. The story of wind power in the United States began much more recently, but it has rapidly evolved.
In the 1800s, westward expansion was largely driven by windmills, and these were windmills used in farms for pumping water. Interestingly, in Texas, they were used not only for pumping water, but also for pumping oil. Some of the earliest picture from Midland, Texas had a lot of the early oil wells, and each house had its own windmill for pumping water and also pumping their oil. Transportation also used wind, where we had our steam engines across the country, and they needed water.
So steam engine trains, often just called steam locomotives, were very popular in the early to mid-1800s and used high-pressure steam to produce the mechanical power needed to get the train to move. How do you make steam? Heat and water. And how do you get that water? Often by using windmills. Elizabeth told us that throughout the West, people would use windmills to pump water from underground into massive water tanks. The steam locomotives could then fill up when they stopped at stations along their route. But when we think about modern wind energy, we're thinking about producing electricity from wind.
That first occurred almost simultaneously in the US and Europe. In Scotland in 1887, James Blythe, a professor, developed a small wind turbine for his house. And in the US, Charles Brush, who was an early energy pioneer, he built a lot of the hydroelectric dams all around the country. He installed a big wind turbine on Euclid Avenue in Cleveland. He had a huge battery bank in the basement of his mansion, and he had wind power there connected to a generator.
But as you'll remember, Charles Brush's setup wasn't cheap.
Good thing he was loaded.
Yeah, for sure. He could afford it, but many people couldn't. So it wasn't until the next century that a more serious interest in wind began to take hold.
You really saw government interest and investment beginning after the oil crisis in 1973.
The 1973 oil crisis was the result of an oil embargo by Arab countries in response to the United States supplying Israel's military with weapons. The embargo put a huge strain on the U.S. economy, and people needed other options. So from 1973 to 1986, the commercial wind turbine market rapidly expanded, in large part due to financial incentives from the U.S. government.
At that time, you had interest globally. You had research programs happening in the US, but also in Germany and also in Denmark. For example, in the US, between 1974 and 1988, the US spent roughly $427 million on wind research. That's roughly $1.68 billion in today's dollars. Germany spent about a quarter of that, and Denmark also spent money as well. We really had a top-down program in the US. It was led by NASA, and it included all of our big aerospace companies. You had Boeing, Lockheed, McDonnell Douglas, Westinghouse, all invested in building some of these wind turbines.
But there was a slight catch. Initially, the facilities couldn't connect to the grid, the network of power plants, transmission lines, and substations that get electricity to your home. So you can have a wind turbine, but if it can't connect to the grid, it doesn't really matter. The 1978 Public Utilities Regulatory Policy Act, or PURPA, changed that. Now the utility industry was open to wind energy developers. And that same year, California passed a law that gave a tax credit for installed wind capacity.
So at that time in California, you had roughly a 50% tax credit for wind and solar, and PURPA ensured that you had a guaranteed market access. So that was the first United States wind boom at that time. I want to point out that the California law focused on giving tax credit for wind installed, not kilowatt hours produced, and the reliability of some of those early turbines was problematic. And that's actually when the Danish turbines started coming into the US market, because they were small, but they were also reliable.
So in the United States in the 1980s, a number of wind turbine models had been developed, but none were particularly reliable. They all had mechanical issues and needed replacement years before anticipated.
The designs of the turbines were not standardized, and they were trying to make very big turbines. And so just the wear and tear on the materials, the gearboxes weren't quite right, and managing wind was very challenging. So the real advantage of the Danish turbines was that you installed them and they produced electricity, as opposed to just installing them and having them not work quite as well. The public challenges with that and the operations and the cost meant that that boom kind of crashed.
But all was not lost.
The Energy Policy Act of 1992 created the production tax credit. So at that point, you were giving 15 cents for every kilowatt hour produced from wind power. So that was the first kind of national level incentive for wind.
Today, the average energy capacity of one onshore wind turbine is 3 to 5 megawatts, which translates to one turbine generating enough electricity to power around 1,000 homes per month.
So for many years, it was the cheapest technology on the block. At that time, solar was 5 to 10 times more expensive, but wind was getting cheaper. So now, Solar and wind vie for being the cheapest type of power you can put on your system.
Solar energy is great, but there are still reasons you'd want to choose wind over solar or to use them in combination.
How wind blows depends on where you are and what time of year it is, and then what the climate conditions are doing that particular year. So I used to be at University of Minnesota, and their wind blows mostly on winter nights. That's a time of pretty high energy demand. And so having wind come into the system winter nights is really helpful for the grid up in that part of the country. Wind is variable. So what grid operators have had to do, and what control systems people, engineers have done as well, is they've developed new ways of controlling the wind turbines. So we talked about the technologies, the wind farms that are built in places you have good wind resources. We've talked about the transmission that's needed to connect those farms to the grid. But I think the control system story is often understudied, but absolutely fascinating.
Elizabeth told us that in the past, when wind was a much smaller resource, if there were any kind of issue going on, the grid operator would call up the wind farm and say, hey, dispatch down, to tell them to produce less electricity or temporarily shut down. And then when the issue was fixed, the grid operator would call again and say, okay, fine to come back online. It was essentially the mom and pop shop era of wind energy.
But when wind became bigger and bigger, we needed wind to behave differently. And so we developed a whole new series of control systems and kind of automation and integration of wind into the power grid. And so now, for example, in the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator that covers the middle of the country, wind bids into markets like any other resource, and it's dispatched automatically, and other resources kind of true up around it. So in the middle of the country where we have incredible wind resources, wind can be providing upwards 50-60% sometimes of the electricity produced in SPP, the southwestern part of the country. Whereas in New England, there's very little wind, there's very little wind resource. It's not a major supplier of electricity.
Of course, when you're talking about the middle of the country, you're talking about onshore wind. But one of the things that I really am so curious about is offshore wind.
So when we talked about the onshore turbines being 3 to 5 megawatts, they're largely limited by our bridges and our roadways. And you can't get those really big pieces to the places you're actually building the turbines. Offshore, you don't have any of those same constraints.
When Elizabeth says really big pieces, she means it. We're talking blades longer than football fields and as long as the turbines are tall.
Imagine you're sitting on a boat and you're motoring away from land out to the horizon, and you see these wind turbines on the horizon. And as you get closer, you can see how big they are. And the ones that are being built in America are as tall as the Hoover Dam, each turbine.
That's Claire Fiesler, an ocean ecologist turned science journalist who spent 2025 reporting on offshore wind for the nonprofit news outlet Canary Media. For reference, the Hoover Dam is 726 feet tall.
And these are incredible feats of engineering. I mean, they're building planes just to transport these turbine blades these days.
And wind farms greatly vary in size, from just a few turbines to many.
Down in Virginia, they're building one that's 176 turbines. So that's 176 Hoover Dams. And those 176 turbines have the capacity to power 600,000 homes in Virginia, which is a lot.
The world's first offshore wind farm was off the coast of Denmark, constructed in 1991. It consisted of 11 turbines, much smaller and producing only a fraction of the power of the ones you see today.
If you live in Europe, you might very well have seen offshore wind farms because there are so many in Scandinavia and in Scotland. Like, I think at any given time, Scotland's power grid, 50% of it at nighttime is being powered by wind, like 50%. Like, that's an incredible amount. So Europe is 30 years ahead of us when it comes to building offshore wind farms because they didn't have the kind of like natural gas, oil reserves that we have in the US. So they had to go harness this resource at sea.
And in fact, China has the highest wind energy capacity and largest number of offshore wind farms, followed by the UK. So other than being able to make bigger turbines that produce more energy, why choose offshore wind versus just keeping turbines on shore?
Out west, you can drive through these vast open areas where they're on land. But I grew up on the East Coast, and we don't have a lot of vast open areas where aren't houses or stores or farms. And so where are there big open spaces? Right in our very shallow continental shelf, just offshore. And that's why it's such an incredible renewable solution for states up and down the East Coast, from Maine all the way down to Georgia.
Many people also don't want to live right next to a big wind farm, which is hard to do on the East Coast in particular, where it's pretty congested with people. So again, having these massive turbines out at sea away from people is a major plus.
Right now, there are 40 areas in the United States coastal waters that have been essentially purchased by or leased by companies to build offshore wind farms. So that's 40 from like the West Coast to the Gulf and along the East Coast. But because of our permitting system, it takes a while to build them. And so we only have one large-scale offshore wind farm operating in America right now, and that is in New York off the coast of Long Island. There's 2 turbines, test turbines off the coast of Virginia, and I was just there a couple months ago. And then there's 3 or 4 off Block Island, Rhode Island. But there are 5 that were being actively built as of December.
But you may have heard that just a couple of days before Christmas, about a month and a half before this episode was released, those 5 large-scale wind projects were ordered by the current administration to stop building.
And almost overnight, the industry went from like being this like massive multi-billion-dollar sector in America to people are wondering, like, are we going to even finish these 5 that were being built?
Here's Elizabeth again.
Stopping everything hurts the U.S. energy sector so much because all of our models have been depending on that power coming in this year, next year, and the year after. So not having access to those planned energy resources doesn't help meet our rising energy demand. It doesn't help our consumers either. And the way that we're running this kind of stop-start campaign has been one that for any big project is incredibly detrimental.
As of when we're publishing this episode, the halt work orders have been lifted, and Elizabeth is hopeful that now that construction is back up and running, we might make it to the finish line with these 5 wind farms off the East Coast.
Okay, I want to make a very hard left turn on what we're talking about. Devoki, have you seen the movie Twisters?
Okay, that was a very hard left turn, and my assumption is you're talking about Twister from like way back when we were in elementary school.
No, I mean Twisters, plural.
Oh, I see.
Hollywood made this film called Twisters, and it was a sequel to the 1990s blockbuster hit, Twister. And in the sequel that came out, I believe it was a year and a half ago, one of the massive tornadoes in the movie, fake computer-generated tornadoes, goes through a wind farm and like crumples a wind turbine. And then the wind turbine like falls across a highway and almost kills, you know, some of the main characters. And then they like swerve around it. And so I wrote a whole articles like, can extreme weather topple wind turbines? And it's happened, I think, twice. Once in America, for sure, in like in Iowa, and then like I found like one incident happening in China. So it doesn't happen that often. If you watch that movie, you'd think, ooh, maybe it happens every time a tornado comes around.
No shade to Twisters because I was actually super entertained on a flight by that movie, but wind turbines are not so surprisingly built with tornadoes in mind. I mean, like at this point, the majority of onshore wind is in places that are more prone to tornadoes. Many turbines are designed to shut off when the winds get too strong, typically around 55 miles per hour, and the turbines will lock and tilt their blades to minimize the impact of high-speed winds. But beyond bad Hollywood science, something Claire has come up against a lot when reporting on wind turbines is the belief that they kill whales. Some people argue that these offshore wind farms could impact the whales' food source, and that the noise from building these turbines, which includes pounding the seabed to install them, is enough to disorient the animals.
But according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, quote, "At this point, there is no scientific evidence that noise resulting from offshore wind site characterization surveys could potentially cause whale deaths. There are no known links between large whale deaths and ongoing offshore wind activities," end quote. How can NOAA make such a bold statement? How do they know anything, in fact, about the impact of these turbines on the ocean environment and its inhabitants? Because of thousands of pages of required research. Within the offshore wind sector, permitting is led by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. And as part of the permitting process, they're required to do an environmental impact statement, or EIS, which are thorough and long.
Now, these documents that are read by me and my students, and probably not too many other people, are thousands of pages long, costing millions of dollars. And in that process, they're asking all of the different environmental questions and bringing in the interests of all of the different agencies, from the Department of Defense to the fisheries to the EPA.
In doing research for this episode, I actually found an EIS on the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management website, and it goes deep. You have appendices looking at air quality, water quality, impact on bats, birds, turtles, marine mammals, various invertebrates. It's a lot. And fortunately, Elizabeth's students at Dartmouth can help you out.
So Sam, we had a class on offshore wind, and all of my students made Wikipedia pages for the U.S. offshore wind projects as part of our class assignment. And in them, they're referencing the EISs directly. And we did it to be a resource for people like you who are curious about the topic, who wanted real information and linking to the real work that was going on.
We've put the 11 Wikipedia page links at the end of the episode transcript, which of course is linked in this episode's description.
Whales aren't the only animals people are concerned about when it comes to wind turbines. A lot of people worry about birds and bats too, and for good reason. Wind turbines absolutely can kill birds and bats. For birds, it's estimated that around 1 million are killed by wind turbines each year. But for context, studies have estimated that between 12 and 64 million birds each year are killed in the US by power lines. And billions of birds are killed by flying into buildings or being a house cat's dinner.
That is so many. I had no concept of how many it was.
Yeah. But we don't want any birds or bats to die if we can prevent it. And so people are working to reduce wind turbine fatalities.
There's been mitigation measures put in place by wind farms where they don't turn on the turbines until the wind reaches a certain speed. And so by doing that, you're not having these like really slow rotations where it's not generating a lot of energy, and it's harder essentially for the birds to kind of like realize that they're moving, I think. And so by only turning on the turbines when the wind reaches a certain speed, they decrease mortalities by a lot.
You also have researchers evaluating pretty simple solutions, like painting one of the turbine rotor blades black to minimize what's called motion smear, which can make the turbine blades appear transparent to birds. In a study published in 2020, a wind power plant in Norway found that this simple change reduced bird fatalities by over 70%. Another cool thing I found was that the American Bird Conservancy has created a wind risk assessment map to inform developers about things like bird migration corridors, so they can avoid putting turbines there. They believe in this green technology, but they also want to minimize the harm.
So based on the science, wind energy is undeniably this amazing resource. Yet there are still people who oppose it. I mean, I can't imagine any technology that literally no one will oppose. But what I think is fascinating is understanding why. Is it because there's science misinformation circulating, or is there something else going on? And that interests Claire too. When we chatted, she told me about someone she spoke to for Canary Media at the end of last year. His name is David Stevenson, and he's at the center of the offshore wind opposition movement. Over the last few years, this movement has gained momentum, and Claire, being in touch with Stevenson throughout that time, saw the transformation firsthand. And what was so fascinating to Claire was what motivated Stevenson's stance on wind. It wasn't that he didn't believe in climate change or the importance of green energy solutions. He absolutely did.
He actually had solar panels on his house. He actually drove a hybrid. He had a strong environmental ethos, but he lived on the coast and he didn't like the view of the turbines. It was a really personal preference. And he really wanted to see nuclear power return and take off.
Claire added that he was also concerned about the upfront cost of these turbines. Although wind is ultimately comparable to other energy sources, there's a very high upfront cost.
And so it's interesting to see how people's kind of like personal motivations shape the rise and the fall of environmental industries and how one man and one movement can shape that. In my reporting, in my journalism, I really try to avoid tropes and oversimplification and to really get to the heart of why people do what they do and put that into context, because it's not always a matter of left and right or male, female, or rural, urban. Those divides sometimes are less relevant or just as relevant as some of these more nuanced forces, and people's personal preferences and personal values really become the heart of why they do what they do.
I really enjoyed talking with Claire about this because I think many of us, even if we don't want to, fall into this trap of oversimplifying or assuming that someone must have gotten some science misinformation somewhere or must be from a certain geographic region or have a whole set of beliefs that they actually don't.
Right. It's easy to have assumptions, but we can learn a lot from challenging them.
Absolutely. Okay, so where are we at with offshore wind? We're moving forward. This is an industry that is growing globally, and it's one more tool in our renewable energy toolbox, which, as we look toward the future, is exciting and, dare I say, essential.
We're at a really interesting time in grid development all around the world, with these new technologies like wind, like solar, and now batteries, transforming how our energy system operates. It's a very exciting time to work in this sector.
All right, Deboki, let's do our tiny show and tell.
Yeah.
Do you want to go? Do you want me to go?
I'll go. Okay.
Yay, okay.
So my tiny show and tell comes courtesy of a segment I heard on the radio the other day.
Ooh.
I was listening to All Things Considered, and Emily Kwong and Regina Barber from NPR's Shortwave podcast, which is the NPR science podcast, they came on to All Things Considered to talk about like the cool science things they had learned about that week.
Yeah.
So I feel like this is kind of like tiny show and tell telephone.
Oh, I like that.
Tiny show and telephone. That's what I should call it.
We're just going to create so many iterations that people are just even more confused.
Yeah. So basically, they are talking about disgust and this thing that scientists have studied in the past called habituation, which is the idea when you're exposed to something again and again, you get less sensitive to it. So particularly in the context of disgust, that would mean you keep seeing something gross. And over time, the more you see it, like the less grossed out you are by it. And scientists at the University of Bristol and at Whitman College wanted to study the idea of habituation, particularly in the context of parenting, because as wonderful as being a parent can be, it also involves many, many gross things.
Yeah. When you started talking about habituation, I literally thought of Amaya's boogery nose and how it like boogers are so disgusting to me, but somehow she can have snot all over her face. And I'm like, it's fine.
Yeah. Yeah. The fact that like I will wipe my son's nose with my bare hands, and then if he does that to his own nose, I'm like, ew, gross. What are you doing? I'm just like, okay, my brain, the priorities have shifted. Okay. So basically, yes, like you're saying, they wanted to know if parenthood can actually help you learn to tolerate disgusting things. So they took 99 parents and then they took 50 non-parents, so people who aren't parents at all. And they would, like, as part of this experiment, they would show them pictures of two things like side by side. So one of those things would be like something neutral. Like I think the example they gave was like a stack of towels, like, you know, just like a thing. But on the other side would be something gross. So things like vomit or classic dirty diapers. I think when they interviewed one of the researchers, they said it was like actually their kids' diapers. Which like, that to me is like the ultimate in the lack of disgust when you're like, why didn't I take a picture of this for science?
Yeah.
So they found that the non-parents would actually tend to avoid looking at the pictures of gross things, but the parents didn't avoid those pictures as much. And the thing that I found really interesting is that this included people who hadn't had young kids in a long time. Like they were still like very tolerant of things like a dirty diaper. Oh. The other detail that I thought was really interesting, taking this outside of the parenting context, which obviously like I think you and I are both like, yeah, diapers. I feel like that is the thing that my brain, like I remember talking to my husband about this where he was like, the thing that I was most worried about with parenting was like the diaper situation. And now it's just like, whatever. Like,
I don't even notice it.
Yeah, it's a poo, whatever.
Yeah.
What are you going to do? But on a non-parenting note, one of the things that I thought was interesting in terms of extrapolating away or seeing like where you could take the study, they talked about how it would be really cool to look at this same kind of experiment, but for other professions like nurses or custodians to see like, you know, are these other professions where people are dealing with things that other people might consider gross? Like, do they develop that same habituation?
I would imagine so, but it would be interesting to see.
Yeah. And I think it'd be interesting to see if it's also as long-term too in the same way. Is this like just how habituation, particularly with disgust, works, where it's something that sticks with you over a long time? Because definitely like I feel like there are things that I used to think were gross that like irrespective of parenting, like you kind of get used to like whatever. But maybe if I kind of return to it now, I would think are gross again.
Yeah.
But I wonder if that's true in all contexts or like if that's more unusual.
Yeah. That's so interesting. Huh.
Yeah.
Cool. I love that. I love that tiny show and telephone.
Yeah.
It's great.
Yeah. Shout out to the Shortwave podcast.
Yeah. Thanks to the Shortwave team. Okay. So Deboki, I am going to share something very different. And it's more just like, hey, this is a cool, very real thing. And it has to do with AI and it has to do with space. And so NASA's Perseverance Mars rover on December 8th and 10th, there was just a press release that I saw that came out about it a few days ago. But on December 8th and 10th, this rover completed the first drives on, they say, another world that were planned by artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have that much to share outside of that. I didn't realize that they were doing that. It makes perfect sense that they were. But essentially what they did was the researchers, so this came out of JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Southern California, which you know well, being a Caltech person, it's in Pasadena. The researchers used generative AI to create these things called waypoints for Perseverance. And so waypoints are the way that NASA defines them, these fixed locations where then the rover gets there and then gets new instructions. Yeah. And so, yeah, I mean, I think this is just kind of fascinating that like, although I'm not saying that it means, you know, this is a big deal, but it's the first pass. And like, this is not saying we don't even need people to ever help with you know, that's not what I'm saying. But I do think it's fascinating. And in my mind, it's like a way of continual exploration when maybe someone can't be there to figure out these waypoints, right? Like, I think that these kinds of autonomous technologies, like even one of the NASA administrators that's quoted says like, you know, they can help missions operate more efficiently. Yeah. And they can also help with different terrains and increase science returns, meaning like we can get more information if we can have a combination of people plus this automation. And so I just thought it was interesting. I mean, I think that there's a lot of really negative things to say about AI a lot of times. Like, I think there's a lot of fear surrounding AI, and I think that some of it is really warranted. Like, some of the stuff is kind of creepy, and like some of the generative AI stuff is really kind of scary. But I will say that this to me feels like a situation where it's really powerful in like a very positive way. Yeah. Yeah. It's so interesting you brought this up because I actually had to like write about this a little. So one of my
other jobs, I guess, some people might know, is I'm the editorial assistant for Dear Hank and John, which in the context of that means that I help Hank Green out with like researching stuff for the podcast, including he does like a little This Week in Mars segment. And so I'll usually like kind of look up and write up some notes on, just what's been going on Mars. So it was interesting writing up the notes on this because I think like a lot of people, I have very conflicted feelings about AI in general, but that's like shaped in part because of the use of generative AI or like the threatened use of generative AI in places that I think are really not great for it.
Right.
Like, in writing, in illustrating, in stealing people's work, and also like in people kind of using AI in ways that I think are a little scary, like in medical situations and stuff. Like I'm very uncomfortable. I understand why we're in that place. But anyways, we won't go down that path.
Yeah. I'm like AI propaganda, AI this, AI that.
Right.
Yeah. There's
the
a lot
AI
of negative.
slop of it all. Yeah. And Kurtz Gazat made this really great video about just some of the ways that AI is also making like search on the internet and like in some ways making like your job and my job kind of harder.
Yeah.
I think like I've definitely found like trying to figure out what's like a good trustworthy source now. It's like it's always been a little bit tough on the internet, but I think it's gotten
harder,
even harder.
Yeah.
But I'm with you too in that I think there are also applications for AI that are really exciting and that make a lot of sense to explore. And this feels potentially like one of them. I think one of the things that's like kind of important to emphasize about these Mars missions is like we're not able to like continuously talk to the rover. Like scientists have to basically look at data sets, figure out what the terrain looks like, and like plot out a route for the rover. And then they have to send out those instructions over the Deep Space Network to the rover. And then the rover gets them and follows them. It's not like we can just continuously be on a call with the rover and tell it what to do.
Right.
And so this is a way to like you're saying, to kind of make it possibly like hopefully more efficient so that we can maybe communicate in ways that'll like let us make even more use out of these missions. Because like we just send these spacecraft to another planet and then just like
and it's there,
have to like hope we can keep working with them.
Yeah.
So I think it's a potentially really exciting way to like make even more use of the spacecraft we have and see what we can get out of these missions, because it's a big investment.
Absolutely. Thanks for providing that additional context.
Yeah.
It's very fortunate for me that you also had to look into this.
Yeah. Yeah, this is like not really like us coming in with the same tiny show and tell. So that's fun too.
Yeah.
But it's still like we can chit chat about it because there are thoughts to have.
Yeah. I love that.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Sam. And thanks for tuning into this week's episode of Tiny Matters, a podcast brought to you by the American Chemical Society and produced by Multitude. This week's script was written by Sam, who is also our exec producer, and edited by Michael David and by me, Deboki Chakravarti. It was fact-checked by Michelle Boucher. Our audio engineer is Misha Stanton.
Thanks so much to Elizabeth Wilson and Claire Fiesler for joining us. As always, you can reach us at tinymatters@acs.org. We'll see you next time.